Hi everyone, my name is Pat and today I want to talk about frame rate. Many of us are familiar with this term as it relates to gaming because of the release of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. But first let's ask ourselves, what does frame rate really mean? What's its history and why is it so important to the game I'm playing? At the beginning of the silent film era, frame rate varied between 14 and 24 frames per second. As you can see, this didn't exactly allow for the smoothest of motion, but they used projectors which would illuminate a single frame 2 or 3 times in order to try to smooth it out. Now let's jump to 1926 when sound was first making its appearances in film and frame rate was becoming a steady 24 frames per second. They would use double blade shutters and triple blade shutters, which would double and triple the frame rate to 48 frames and 72 frames respectively. Now let's talk about the present. The release of the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 have seen frame rate become even more important than it ever has been. Enthusiasts argue about the differences in frame rate between consoles all the time, and it's true that Microsoft has had to increase the power of the GPU in the Xbox One, or graphics processing unit, in order to match the frame rate of the PlayStation 4 in some titles. They did this, however, at a sacrifice. They did have to give up some resolution for some titles. So why is it so important? Am I even going to notice the difference between 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second, you might ask? The answer, to the surprise of some, is yes. While it is true that the eye can usually only distinguish individual images at around 12 frames per second, the eye can differentiate fluidity and differences in fluidity at frame rates that sometimes can even exceed up to 60 frames per second. High frame rate is especially important for first-person shooters and online games because high frame rate is incredibly important for reaction time. Frame rate in a game might not even necessarily always be constant. A lot of the times, these 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second that we hear about all the time are really just the caps. The actual observed frame rate might be slightly below the reported cap. This is usually to increase stability and decrease variance in the frame rate. Now, even with these really high frame rates, the motion might not always be 100% fluid in a game. It's a combination of the use of motion blurring technology and the human persistence of vision that are responsible for the super nice motion that we see in games today. So what do you think? Is frame rate really that important? Do you even notice a difference? Has it influenced your choice in either a console or a title? Let us know in the comments below. Closing the inventory now. Have a good night and play some great games.